Nigeria has been a country since 1960, and in all of that time, 66 years, nobody in government has been able to answer this one question cleanly. Which law actually governs Nigerians? Because right now, in 2026, 12 states in northern Nigeria are running a full criminal legal code based on Sharia, with courts, sentencing, and enforcement, while the same constitution that allows that also declares Nigeria a secular federal republic under common law. Two systems, one country, zero resolution. And here's what nobody is asking. While the US Congress and Northern Islamic Councils trade press statements and everybody picks a side, what does a pan-Igbo organization issuing what amounts to an ultimatum to the National Assembly actually mean for Nigeria's future? Is this a genuine constitutional demand, a political play, or a warning shot nobody in Abuja is taking seriously enough? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what game is being played, who's moving the pieces, and what happens next. Before we go deeper, if you're just finding Naijanewsfeed, welcome. This channel exists to break down what's really happening in Nigerian politics without the noise, without the spin. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because this one gets interesting. Alright, let's build the foundation. To understand why a pan-Igbo group issued what amounts to a constitutional ultimatum in February 2026, you need to follow the chain of events, because this didn't start in Nigeria, it started in Washington. October 31st, 2025, President Donald Trump redesignates Nigeria as a country of particular concern, a formal US government label for nations with systematic violations of religious freedom. Nigeria had this designation before under Trump's first term. Biden removed it in 2021. Trump brought it back. And that designation came with teeth. Trump personally tasked Congressman Riley Moore of West Virginia, alongside House Appropriations Committee Chairman Tom Cole, to lead a formal congressional investigation into what Moore described as the persecution of Christians in Nigeria. Moore and a bipartisan delegation traveled to Nigeria. They met with victims, internally displaced persons, religious leaders, and senior Nigerian government officials, including the National Security Advisor, Nuhu Ribadu. February 23, 2026, Moore presents his official report to the White House. The recommendations include a US-Nigeria security agreement, possible sanctions and visa restrictions against individuals linked to violence, withholding of certain US funds until Nigeria demonstrates progress, and crucially, a formal demand for the repeal of Sharia and blasphemy laws in the 12 northern states where they operate. That last recommendation set off a chain reaction. The Supreme Council for Sharia in Nigeria, the SCSN, fired back almost immediately. Their Secretary General, Nafiu Ahmed, said flatly that no power on earth could compel Nigerian Muslims to abandon Sharia. He called the US proposal misinformed and an attack on Nigeria's sovereignty. That pushback from the Islamic Council is what directly triggered the Ndi Igbo Worldwide Union statement. Their position, issued on February 27th and 28th, signed by President Benjamin Nwanku and Secretary Charles Edemuzo, was stark. The fact that the Islamic Council is openly defying calls for constitutional reform proves, in their words, that the Nigerian state in its current configuration is no longer sustainable. And they went further. They told the National Assembly it faces a binary choice: remove Sharia from the constitution and preserve peace, or preside over the fracture of Nigeria. No middle ground. Clock is ticking. That's what triggered this conversation. Now, let's understand the structure beneath it. Here's where most people get confused. So let's get the legal architecture right, because the devil is absolutely in these details. Nigeria's 1999 constitution does something unusual. It declares Nigeria a federal republic, guarantees fundamental rights, and, in theory, prevents the federal government from adopting a state religion. Section 10 of the Constitution is explicit. The government of the federation or of a state shall not adopt any religion as state religion. That's the secular guarantee. But here's where it gets complicated. The same constitution, in its 5th schedule and the provisions around state courts, creates the legal room for state Sharia courts to operate, specifically on personal and family matters for Muslims. So the constitutional intent was Sharia is okay for personal matters, marriage, divorce, inheritance, among consenting Muslim citizens. That is a plural legal system, not unlike how customary courts also operate in many southern states. Here's the pivot point that matters. Starting in 1999, ironically the same year the current constitution was adopted, Zamfara state expanded Sharia to cover criminal matters, full Sharia penal code. 12 other northern states followed. That expansion from personal law to criminal law is where the constitutional tension lives. Under this expanded Sharia, you can have sentences like amputation for theft, stoning for adultery, and death for blasphemy. These have been handed down, though actual executions under Sharia criminal law have been rare due to appeals and commutations. But the framework is there. The courts are sitting. Now, here is what makes the Ndi Igbo Union's demand structurally difficult. You cannot simply remove Sharia from the constitution as though it's a single clause. The relationship between Sharia courts, state law, federal law, and the constitutional guarantee of religious freedom is layered. Any constitutional amendment requires a 2/3 majority of the National Assembly, plus approval from at least 24 of Nigeria's 36 state houses of assemblies. And Nigeria is also a member of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. That membership has its own diplomatic implications. So the Ndi Igbo Worldwide Union is correct when they say you can't simply impose a uniform common law system overnight without dismantling the 1999 Constitution first. They are actually making a legally coherent point, and that makes their ultimatum more serious, not less. Here's what nobody is talking about. The group isn't just demanding legal reform, they are explicitly raising the option of a referendum to create a safe haven in the East for persecuted Christian citizens. That is a sentence that should have stopped every Nigerian politician cold. We'll come back to what that actually means.
This is the section that separates a news headline from actual understanding. Let's go layer by layer. Layer 1. Who is the Ndi Igbo Worldwide Union? This matters and is worth being honest about. One Abuja-based media outlet noted that the Ndi Igbo Worldwide Union is not among the most widely recognized Igbo socio-cultural umbrella bodies. Their leadership footprint and membership base remain unclear compared to established organizations like Ohaneze Ndi Igbo. But here's why that doesn't make this story insignificant, and here's why you should pay attention anyway. The content of their statement has been picked up, reported, and debated across virtually every major Nigerian media platform. Sahara Reporters, Vanguard, Daily Post, The Guardian Nigeria, Daily Times, Independent. The statement itself has done damage or moved the needle depending on where you stand. In Nigerian politics, a statement that generates this volume of response has political weight regardless of the source's formal standing. And there are also other Igbo groups, including the Ala Igbo Development Foundation, raising similar concerns through separate but parallel channels. The constitutional argument is gaining traction across Igbo civil society, not just from one group. Layer 2. Why now? Timing in Nigerian politics is never accidental. The US CPIC redesignation, Trump's personal assignment of Moore to investigate, and the subsequent congressional report created an opening, a moment when the Sharia debate had international legitimacy and oxygen. The Igbo Union used that window strategically. They aligned their position with a US Congress recommendation, which gave them a degree of international cover for what is otherwise an extremely politically sensitive domestic argument. Think about what that does. It makes it harder for the Nigerian government to dismiss their position without also appearing to dismiss US concerns. That's a smart political move. Layer 3. Who benefits? Follow the incentives. For Igbo political actors and civil society organizations, particularly those sympathetic to restructuring or who carry historical trauma from the Biafran War, this debate does several things simultaneously. It refrains Igbo political grievances in the language of constitutional rights and legal equality rather than ethnic separatism. It links Igbo concerns to a broader Christian persecution narrative that has international sympathy, particularly in Trump's Washington. And it applies pressure on the federal government, specifically on the National Assembly and on President Tinubu, to take a visible position. President Tinubu, for his part, is caught between constituencies. His ACP coalition spans both northern Muslim power bases essential to his political survival and southern Christian communities, including a large segment of the Igbo and Yoruba voter base. Any position he takes on Sharia reform alienates someone critical. That ambiguity is politically expensive for him, and Tinubu's opponents know it. Layer 4. Who stands to lose? Northern political and religious leadership has the most to lose from any genuine constitutional renegotiation of Sharia status. Sharia criminal law in the North is not just a religious institution, it is a political tool. Governors and political actors in those states have historically used Islamic institutions, including Hizbah, the Sharia enforcement bodies, to consolidate community authority and mobilize electoral support. Any reform that touches those structures isn't just a legal question, it is a direct threat to how power is built and maintained in those states. The SCSN's furious response wasn't just religious passion, it was institutional self-preservation. Layer 6. The silent players. Watch the presidency. Watch the National Assembly leadership. Watch Ohaneze Ndigu, the most recognized pan-Igbo socio-cultural body. If Ohaneze formally endorses the constitutional restructuring argument, the political weight behind it increases dramatically. If they stay quiet, that tells you something too. Also watch the U.S. State Department's next moves. Moore's report is in the White House. The Nigeria Religious Freedom and Accountability Act of 2026, H.R. 7456, has been introduced in Congress. If that bill progresses, it carries sanctions leverage. The Nigerian government will be watching that closely. We haven't yet talked about what the Igbo Union actually means when they propose a safe haven in the East. That language has very specific historical weight in Nigeria. I'm going to come back to that, and it will change how you read this whole story. Now, if what I just laid out surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know your take before we get to the part that changes the whole picture. Let's zoom out. What does this actually mean for Nigeria as a country? On federal-state balance. This debate cuts to the heart of Nigeria's federal arrangement. Nigeria operates a federal system where states have significant autonomy, which is how 12 northern states were able to expand Sharia criminal law in the first place, without federal interference. The current debate forces a question that Nigerian political architecture has been deliberately designed to avoid. Does federal constitutional supremacy actually override state-level religious law when they are in tension? The honest answer right now is nobody wants to test it, because testing it means a constitutional crisis, and nobody in Abuja, North or South, is eager for that fight. On national cohesion, Nigeria is roughly 50% Muslim and 50% Christian, give or take. The country's stability has always rested on a fragile managed existence, a deliberate silence on certain questions that, if answered too clearly, would break the arrangement. The Sharia debate is precisely that kind of question. The Igbo Union statement, whatever its organizational weight, makes that silence harder to maintain. When a group explicitly says the current arrangement is dead and lists two outcomes, constitutional reform or fragmentation, it forces every political actor to publicly choose a lane. That is destabilizing by design. On the economy, foreign investors watch political stability. Nigeria is already under significant economic pressure, high inflation, currency depreciation, debt servicing costs eating up a huge portion of federal revenue. A sustained and public constitutional crisis over the legal status of Sharia would be exactly the kind of signal that causes foreign capital to sit on its hands and wait. Add to that the possibility of U.S. sanctions, which the Moore report explicitly recommends, and you have a scenario where Nigeria's economic exposure to this political fight is significant. On security, The Igbo Union statement directly references the killing of Deborah Samuel, a college student lynched in 2022 after being accused of blasphemy, and the continued captivity of Leah Sharibu, the schoolgirl kidnapped by Boko Haram in 2018, whose Christian faith is widely cited as the reason she was not released with her classmates. These are not abstract legal cases, they are emotional and political flashpoints. Every time they are invoked, they raise the temperature on already tense interfaith relations, and in a country with active insurgencies, banditry, and communal violence already straining security forces, raising that temperature carries real risk. Here's something most coverage is missing. The Islamic Council's response actually conceded quietly. The SCSN said the Nigerian government appears either indifferent or incapable of resolving the security problem. That is a northern Islamic body publicly criticizing Tinubu's government. In a row that's framed as North versus South, both sides are actually pointing at Abuja.
This story has a genuinely significant international dimension, so we need to spend 2 minutes here. The U.S. redesignation of Nigeria as a country of particular concern in October 2025 was not a bureaucratic move. It was a political statement from a White House that has made the protection of persecuted Christians a visible foreign policy priority. The Moore report submitted to the White House in February 2026 represents the culmination of months of formal congressional investigation. What that means practically is that the Nigerian government is now operating under documented U.S. scrutiny on this issue. The proposed Nigeria Religious Freedom and Accountability Act, H.R. 7457, if it passes, will require the U.S. Secretary of State to submit formal reports on U.S. efforts to address Christian persecution in Nigeria. That creates an ongoing accountability mechanism that outlasts any one news cycle. The leverage question. The Moore report explicitly recommended withholding certain U.S. funds until Nigeria demonstrates progress, as well as potential sanctions and visa restrictions against individuals linked to violence or complicity. Nigeria is not heavily dependent on U.S. foreign aid in the way some other African nations are, but the reputational and diplomatic costs of sustained U.S. pressure matter. They affect trade relationships, multilateral lending environments, and the ease with which Nigerian elites access the U.S. financial system and travel to America. That last point, travel and financial access, is where sanctions get personal for Nigerian political actors, and personal consequences tend to change political calculations faster than abstract diplomatic pressure. The OIC dimension. The Igbo Union specifically called out Nigeria's membership of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation as a structural contradiction, a country that claims common law but is also a formal member of an organization built around Islamic governance principles. This is a long-standing sore point for many Nigerian Christians. It doesn't have an easy resolution. Nigeria joined the OIC quietly in 1986 under the Babangida government, a decision that triggered protests at the time and has never been fully relitigated. For the diaspora, if you're a Nigerian watching this from the UK, the US, or Canada, this debate matters to you for 2 reasons. First, it will shape the political and security climate that your family at home has to live in. Second, how Nigeria handles U.S. diplomatic pressure on this will affect Nigerian foreign policy posture and bilateral relationships where many of you live and work. Pay attention to whether the National Assembly actually moves on any constitutional reform or whether this gets buried like so many Nigerian reform promises before it. Let's be fair and precise here, because this story is being misread in multiple directions. Misconception number 1. This is simply a North versus South, Muslim versus Christian conflict. That framing is too clean and it's wrong. The Islamic Council's own statement acknowledged that the security crisis in Nigeria has killed both Muslims and Christians. Multiple Islamic scholars who spoke on this issue, including Sheikh Haliru Maraya in Kaduna, noted that in states like Kaduna, the majority of victims of armed violence in recent years were from Muslim-majority communities. The violence is real. The framing of it as a one-way religious war is contested and in many cases analytically incorrect. The actual driving forces, as most serious security analysts will tell you, include resource competition, land use conflicts between farmers and herders, state failure, and organized criminal networks operating under various political and religious covers. That doesn't make the blasphemy laws any less problematic, but it means the solution is more complex than simply repealing Sharia. Misconception number 2. The US Congress is acting purely on humanitarian grounds. Read the full record here. One Islamic scholar, Professor Ishaq Akintola of Muslim Rights Concern, pointed out correctly that the Moore report also recommended that Nigeria stop buying Russian weapons and purchase American arms instead. He asked a reasonable question: whose interest does that serve? This is not a reason to dismiss all US concerns about Christian persecution, which are documented and serious, but it is a reason to understand that US foreign policy, even when it aligns with genuine human rights concerns, also serves US strategic and economic interests. Both things can be true simultaneously. Misconception number 3. The Igbo Union's position is purely a constitutional argument. Here's where we need to close that first open loop I mentioned earlier. The statement by the Ndi Igbo Worldwide Union doesn't just call for constitutional reform, it explicitly invokes the possibility of a peaceful referendum establishing a safe haven in the East for persecuted Judeo-Christian citizens. Their secretary, Charles Edemuzo, directly compared this to England guaranteeing sanctuary for Protestants from France and said, quote, "Biafra can serve as a modern-day sanctuary." That word, Biafra, is not an accident. It carries the weight of a civil war that killed between 1 and 3 million people between 1967 and 1970, the majority of whom were Igbo. Invoking it even obliquely in a 2026 press statement is a deliberate political signal. It is saying we are not just asking for legal reform, we are raising the spectre of what happens if legal reform doesn't come. Whether that's a genuine position or a negotiating tactic designed to create urgency, that is the question every Nigerian policymaker should be asking right now. The strongest argument on the other side isn't religious, it's constitutional. Northern legal scholars have long argued that the 1999 Constitution, as written, already limits Sharia to Muslims who consent to its jurisdiction, meaning non-Muslims cannot be subject to it. If that reading is correct, the issue isn't Sharia's existence, it's enforcement, and enforcement is a governance failure, not a constitutional one. That framing, if accepted, changes the entire policy prescription.
What happens next? Here's what I'm watching and what you should watch. Most likely moves in the near term. The Tinubu government will try to manage this through diplomatic language, expressing commitment to constitutional review, religious dialogue, and security reforms, without actually committing to a timeline or specific legislative action on Sharia. That is the path of least political resistance. Expect statements about Nigeria's plural legal heritage and the importance of interfaith dialogue. Expect the National Assembly to refer the issue to some committee. Expect very little concrete movement. The US will continue applying pressure through the legislative track. Watch whether H.R. 7457, the Nigeria Religious Freedom and Accountability Act, progresses through the House Foreign Affairs Committee. If it does, it becomes a live diplomatic lever. If it stalls, the pressure from Washington becomes less credible. Northern political and religious leadership will hold firm on Sharia's constitutional status. The SCSN statement was not a negotiating opening. It was a hard line. Don't expect any northern governor or senator to publicly support Sharia reform ahead of any future election cycle. Escalation signals to watch. If Ohaneze Ndibo, the main pan-Igbo body, formally endorses the constitutional restructuring argument, the political weight on that side increases significantly. That would be a major development. If the US moves towards actual sanctions, not just recommendations, the Nigerian government's calculation changes fast. Watch the State Department's country of particular concern follow-up actions. If more Igbo groups issue similar statements, or if the language of safe haven in the East starts appearing in other political discourse, you are watching the early signals of a more serious constitutional restructuring conversation beginning to crystallize. Best case scenario: the constitutional review process that Nigerian civil society has been demanding for years gets genuine traction, not as a response to US pressure, but because Nigerian political leadership finally recognizes that the dual legal system ambiguity is a structural threat to the country's long-term stability. Sharia personal law remains fully protected. Sharia criminal law is harmonized with federal constitutional guarantees of equal treatment. Governance and security failures, which drive the violence on the ground, are addressed through actual institutional reform. That is a scenario that requires political courage Nigeria's ruling class has not yet demonstrated. Worst-case scenario: the conversation stays at the level of press statements and political theater. No constitutional reform happens. Religiously framed violence continues. The US escalates to actual sanctions. The economic pressure feeds domestic discontent, and the language of fragmentation, which the Igbo Union has now placed on the table, starts to feel less rhetorical and more structural. Nigeria has survived existential crises before, but surviving them without resolving them means the next crisis arrives with less institutional resilience to absorb it. Now, closing. The word Biafra appeared in a formal political statement in February 2026. That is the real story underneath this story. Not because separation is imminent, but because the language of separation, which had been largely confined to IPOB and more radical platforms, is now appearing in the formal communications of groups positioning themselves as constitutional advocates. That normalization of the language is itself a political development, regardless of what the groups intend by it. We started with one question: which law actually governs Nigerians? After everything we've covered, here is the honest answer. Nigeria operates two overlapping legal systems with a constitutional architecture that was deliberately designed to be ambiguous about their relationship. That ambiguity was a political compromise made in 1999, and for 26 years it has been maintained by the same political class that benefits from not resolving it. What February 2026 represents is a moment when multiple pressures, US foreign policy, Igbo civil society, ongoing violence, and a constitutional accountability gap converged publicly in a way that is harder to absorb quietly than in previous cycles. Will the National Assembly act? History says probably not, at least not quickly and not substantially. But here's what I want you to take away. The conversation has shifted. When formal civil society organizations start using the word Biafra in constitutional arguments, not as separatists, but as constitutional advocates, and when the US Congress has a live bill with sanctions language attached to Nigeria's religious freedom situation, the cost of continued inaction is going up. Nigeria's government can choose to lead that conversation or be dragged into it. What do you think? Is this a genuine constitutional crisis in the making, or is it political noise that will dissipate in 6 months? Drop your take in the comments. I read every one of them. If this breakdown gave you clarity on what's really going on, do me a favor, share it with one person who needs to understand this. Like the video, subscribe to Nigerian Newsfeed, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp.